ads, we've seen the campaigns, we've seen initiatives passed. So clearly there's been some success there, and there have been some real people behind these cultural changes. These things aren't just happening. There's a lot of work and a lot of energy and a lot of fundraising and a lot of thinking that happens behind these large cultural shifts that we're seeing that's allowing us to gather here today and have these great open conversations about psychedelics and marijuana. So we have a lot of these people with us here today. Just very briefly, I'm going to ask everybody to give a brief, just sort of 2 or 3 minute hello or introduction, just sort of explaining who they are and what they have been working on with regards to drug policy reform surrounding psychedelics and or marijuana. But first I'll just do a brief introduction here. Starting from the end here, we have Mr. Aaron Houston, the former executive director, recently former of Students for Sensible Drug Policy. If anybody's familiar with the success and the growth of that organization over the last few years, just say hello to Mr. Houston. Next we have Tom Angel, founder of Marijuana Majority. Tom's worked with law enforcement against prohibition and SSDP and has a long history of work in this field. Now we have Jack Davies. Jack Davies is current publications manager for the Drug Policy Alliance. He's done a lot of work bringing this conference together and this panel. Jack's worked in drug policy reform for more than a decade, has worked in psychedelics for MAPS, as well as for the ACLU, so has a broad perspective to bring to this as well. Next we have Anna Sostek, who is the current communications manager for the Women's Visionary Congress and the executive secretary for the Society of Cannabis Clinicians, a group of clinicians working for education among physicians and clinicians to teach them new ways to actually help their patients with cannabis now that it's increasingly legitimate. Followed by Ted Trimpa. Ted Trimpa is the principal and president of Trimpa Group. Trimpa has been working for more than a decade in government relations and has an extensive amount of political consulting experience with a lot of areas of rights and policy-based initiatives. Last we have Jason Salzman. He's from here in Denver, so thank you for hosting us here in your beautiful hometown, Jason. Jason is a former media critic for the Rocky Mountain News here, and the author of numerous books, including Making Your News, a guide for activists and nonprofits, which is actually a very effective and popular textbook. And he's also the co-founder of that communications, working for progressive PR clients. So I'm going to ask Aaron just to give us a quick start. Just to throw in a little curveball here. In addition to saying who you are and what your current work is and background is surrounding drug policy reform, I'm also curious, I'd like to say a little bit about what to you this word legitimacy means when it comes to psychedelics and or marijuana, if there's a difference. But you know, we talk about the legitimation of these substances in mainstream media and culture. I feel like we might have different perspectives regarding that, so a little reflection.
Thank you. That's a great question. Aaron Houston, and I've had the tremendously good fortune of leading Students for Sensible Drug Policy for the last 3 years. For those who aren't familiar, Students for Sensible Drug Policy is a network of 3,000 student activists on 200 campuses, managed by 4 full-time staffers working out of 192 square feet of office space. So if you're not already familiar with us, you check out ssdp.org. I spent 7 years before that as the only full-time marijuana legalization lobbyist on Capitol Hill in Washington, D.C. And you know, that lent a very unique perspective on how the legitimation of this stuff goes. And I also had the good fortune of working with MAPS on its Quaker application for the University of Massachusetts, which was ridiculously delayed over time. So, you know, I've seen from both perspectives at this point in my career the legitimation of marijuana, both as a medicine and for recreational purposes now, more and more. But also, you know, getting to see the stories that that some of our opponents tell with respect to psychedelics in general. But most recently with the Electric Zoo incidents and various electronic music, dance music festival deaths, those stories are becoming a lot more important, and how we tell those stories, if we're telling them in a medical context, a medicalization context, or a recreational context. I think we have to be very intentional about how we talk specifically about MDMA. But I think it's also worth reflecting on, Brad, to answer your question, the legitimization of a drug like MDMA in particular, to me means that anybody should be able to use it. Anybody should be able to use it with the proper medical advice, but some sort of appropriate control on the distribution of it. But overall, MDMA is an amazing drug. And I don't mind saying that right on stage here. MDMA is an amazing drug. If it's not abused and used in the wrong way, has tremendous potential to connect people together. And I think telling those positive stories rather than having stories about death and trying to figure out how we actually get our facts out there before the opponent's facts are out there, which are often wrong.
Thank you. Yeah.
And my name is Tom Angel. I've been working in the drug policy reform movement for a little over a decade now. I actually started off as a student activist with SSDP at the University of Rhode Island. And after I graduated, I went to work at the SSDP National Office for about 4 years. And then I worked on the staff of Law Enforcement Against Prohibition for about 4 years. And over the course of that work, I focused primarily on media relations and communications and PR. I'm just trying to generate positive news coverage about the need to change these policies. Last year, I left my job at LEAP to start an organization called Marijuana Majority, which focuses very specifically on trying to get people to understand and realize that the debate about marijuana reform is mainstream, and a majority of voters support that. Because I feel like one of the biggest problems we have in the drug policy reform movement is that we do have majority support for legalizing marijuana and many of the other reforms that we support, but politicians don't treat it as such. They still think it's some third-rail, dangerous issue, and they'll be attacked. So we're just trying to let people know that this political and social space exists for them to embrace these reforms, and they'll be rewarded for it and not attacked. In terms of legitimacy, I'm actually maybe going to come at this question from a little bit different angle. My work doesn't really focus on legitimizing drugs. I'm not so much concerned with that. I'm much more concerned with legitimizing the debate about the need to reform the policies dealing with these drugs. I feel like it's not as important to really change people's minds about how they feel about drugs and whether or not they would want their family members to use them. I just think that it's important to get people to realize that even if they hate these drugs and they think that they're the worst thing in the world, prohibiting them just makes them more dangerous and causes more problems.
Thanks, Tom.
Hi, my name is Jack Davies. I'm the publications manager for the Drug Policy Alliance, and started out my career about a decade ago working in the psychedelic research field with MAPS. And then shifted to working on drug policy more generally with the ACLU and now with DPA. And I think at the Drug Policy Alliance now and within the movement more generally, now that marijuana legalization is not inevitable at this point, but it's certainly developed really unprecedented momentum. I think probably a lot of you heard Ethan say in the plenary yesterday that he thinks we've finally reached a quote-unquote tipping point. We're having a lot of conversations about how we can make sure that the door doesn't get slammed shut behind marijuana legalization, that we can take the lessons learned from that movement and apply it to drug policy reform more generally. And in terms of the question of legitimacy, I guess that makes me think of different models of legal regulation and sort of clarifying what legalization actually means. Legalization is a process, really. It's not the end goal. And within the spectrum of legal regulation of drugs, there can be an incredible amount of variation. And the regulations that might be appropriate for marijuana would obviously be different for other drugs, and we need to sort of assess the relative risks and benefits of each drug sort of on its own terms to determine what the appropriate levels of regulation would be. So there's a number of bloggers and people like that sort of pose this question in the media, is MDMA the new pot, or are psychedelics the new pot? And obviously the answer is no. There's some similarities.
Well, we're done.
Yeah.
Thank you, everybody.
But I think that by looking at what factors have played into the enormous shift and surprising shift in public opinion and public discourse around public policy around marijuana the past few years, there's a lot of interesting opportunities to think about how that applies to other drugs like psychedelics.
Thanks, John.
I'm Anna Zostek, and I work for two organizations. The first one is the Women's Visionary Congress, which was founded in 2007 as a response to the overwhelming majority of men speaking at events having to do with drug policy, psychedelics, and cannabis. So we host yearly events and also salons in various cities that give women speakers and also some male speakers a chance to share their work in the field of consciousness expansion research and activism and art and so forth. And I also am the executive secretary for the Society of Cannabis Clinicians, which is a California organization that's working to establish practice standards for doctors recommending cannabis and to educate physicians all over the world who are suddenly having the ability to recommend cannabis and they have no idea how to go about doing that. In terms of legitimacy, I would consider a substance legitimate when the vast majority of the populace accept that substance on some level is relatively safe, and when that populace has sufficient medical and educational resources to use that substance safely and effectively.
My name is Ted Trimba. I was an attorney with major law firms for 15 years, and then 3 years ago I actually went out on my own. And what I do now basically is social reform and work with individual donors to align and see the intersection of philanthropic spending with policy spending with political spending. And most notably, I've been involved in the gay rights movement, particularly in the state level politics that have happened over the last 6 years. And then I've also been involved with marijuana, medical marijuana here in Colorado, and then working around the implementation of legalization here. So from my perspective, whether we consider something legitimate or not, if we're going to have an opening for the possibility of a change in the law, whether that be one small piece of federal law or maybe one small piece in some state somewhere, there's going to have to be some level of what I call political indifference or neutrality. And I'm not saying that the marijuana movement is going to be exactly like what the psychedelic movement would be, but I think for that opening of the law to happen, the possibility of that opening, that political environment has got to change. And how you change that political environment may have a number of components. And in my mind, the objective on that political environment change doesn't have to be acceptance and epiphany. Oh my God, I was wrong all those years. Gee whiz, let's do psychedelics. This weekend, let's get in touch. It's going to be that they no longer see it as a political bad for them. And they're just kind of indifferent. People aren't getting hurt. I'm kind of neutral on it. And maybe we could be spending a lot of this drug enforcement money someplace else. That, in my mind, then, is that first step of legitimacy that then would give, hopefully, the opening for some type of legal change. Oh, and by the way, I'm with you. Women's Visionary Congress, I just have to say, if gay men and women could run the world,
is I think that we've reached legitimacy when we can say, yes, I do psychedelics. You can say it in public, you can say it as a parent, you can say it as a student, you can say it as a potential employee of any company. That to me is legitimacy. Same with marijuana. And so it's comparable to being out. It's that whole concept of when we reach that point where we can be out about our psychedelic use, about our drug use, and we've reached a point of cultural change, really, which will, I think, precede the political change, which we actually saw, I think, with gay rights movement, also with marijuana, that we have to look toward, cultural 2.0, cultural 1.0 got us where we are, I think, with marijuana. And it will be totally different, but we will get there with psychedelics. I really believe it. It's just going to take time. So what brings me, I think, to the panel is I have a broader view of communications and advocacy and political campaigns. I've written quite a bit about it and have a small company that focuses on communications for those types of organizations. And also, my family started the Telluride Mushroom Festival, which is an annual mushroom gathering in Telluride, Colorado, which has, since its inception about 25, 30 years ago, really focused mostly on psychedelics. There's more to mushrooms than edible and culinary mushrooms, some of you may know. Even though they don't grow in Colorado, we've had over the years speakers, who've been talking about legitimacy and talking in a room like this. I mean, this room is legitimacy for drugs and for psychedelics. Talking about them openly, trying to generate the kind of debate that we want in politics and in our culture around drugs. So I think that's also partly why I was sort of seen as someone who should be on a panel.
Yeah, for sure. Thanks, Chase. Wow, yeah, we have a lot of different perspectives brought to this table here. That was actually exactly what I was hoping to have happen, which was that legitimacy is a million different things. It's certainly important when it comes to political legitimacy, which is to say laws that do not prohibit the use of certain substances, and it's certainly true when it comes to our culture surrounding the use and representation of these substances. Legitimacy is also, are we comfortable talking about it around the dinner table? Are we comfortable coming out about it? Are we comfortable making it known that this is something that we use and participate in? That's another level of legitimacy. And there's ways in which we can have legitimacy in some areas and still not have them in others. One example of this that I think Aaron brought up was marijuana. So we have this obvious rebranding of marijuana happening, where it's no longer something that the kids are smoking and no longer doing anything with their lives, but they're actual legitimate professionals and presidents using this drug, and it's kind of a thing that people do, like they drink wine, and it's kind of, we're starting to hear these more in the media and in popular culture, but at the same time, there's actual concrete barriers to marijuana research that are still happening, that are in place because of old laws preventing researchers from accessing the drug. So there's different ways that legitimacy can be happening at a cultural level, and still at a legal level, it's not happening. So one thing that was brought up here, just in this introduction, was that perhaps the answer to the question, are psychedelics the new pot, is no. Well, in that case, what are they? So I think we can be in agreement that marijuana has gone through a rebranding. Does anybody? I mean, I'm welcome to entertain. So we've seen a change in how we're talking about marijuana and how we're acting around marijuana as a culture and as policies. Have we seen that around psychedelics? Is that happening? So are we even talking about a real thing here? Or is it just a small group of people who have started coming together and celebrating psychedelics as a new countercultural revival, or is there actually something new happening here? And I'd be curious about all of your perspectives on that, or anybody who would like to to say something about that, based on your experience.
Well, I mean, I would say, thanks. You know, I would say that I think in the same way, thank you for sharing that about your family's mushroom festival. I love hearing that. I'm a native of Denver, actually, originally.
Actually, my father right there started it.
Oh, wow. I used to go to church camp in Telluride, actually, so. You know, I think that in the same way, you know, one point that I did want to make is that I think a restricted medical context is not ideal, probably, and so as we move forward, you know, my ideal would be that psychedelics are more available rather than less available to people. I do think that the legitimization and that acceptance that you're talking about, and being able to say, I use psychedelics, you know, from an anecdotal perspective, I think I see that more and more. I think that in the way that many people use marijuana is a spiritual experience for them, they also use psychedelics and have a profound you know, psychedelic and religious experience when they've experienced that, you know, and that's it can be a life-changing event for people who are familiar with that. It can actually be, you know, a truly groundbreaking event. So in that way, you know, it may be even more dangerous to say, I use psychedelics than I use marijuana, because obviously many more people use marijuana, first of all, and second, it is maybe even more vulnerable and dangerous thing to share. But also in that way, it's so profound, it's so moving for individuals who have experienced it, that it probably is an additional motivating factor.
Yeah, I think that there has been a change in the last, say, 10, 15 years insofar as I think mainstream media attention on psychedelics in particular is not as hostile, but more like bemused. I mean, you still have people who think it's a danger and a threat to society, but compared to what it was in the 60s, 70s, like for instance, the O'Reilly factor covered the Telluride Mushroom Festival this past year. And they sent out a correspondent actually that participated in the mushroom parade and in the park dancing where a lot of people were, you know, using psychedelics. And the report that they showed, you know, it wasn't like Bill O'Reilly was pissed or angry saying this is a threat to the country. He was bemused by it. He was opposed to it, but he's laughing at it mostly. And I think that is a significant difference for what it's worth.
Yeah, humor can be a powerful diffuser.
Yeah, I think something that's changed a lot with psychedelic research is just this past decade that the research is actually moving forward, and it's staying more true to the medical model than marijuana has in a lot of ways. As I'm sure a lot of you know, there's thousands of studies done with psychedelics in the 50s and 60s. For 20, 30 years, in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, research was completely shut down. And it's only the past 10 years or so that there's been a gradual stream of studies popping back up about psychedelics. And perhaps because they're used by such a smaller segment of the population and perceived as being more radical or dangerous in some ways, perhaps staying with the medical approach is a safer route than sort of jumping ahead to finding a political solution and taking them, you know, treating them as a recreational drug like alcohol, tobacco, or something like that, which we sort of carved out this special category for that's separate from all of other drugs. You know, that brings up an important distinction too, where the ironic thing is that like what MAPS is working to do is to put both marijuana and psychedelic drugs through FDA clinical trials to develop them into prescription medicines or to prove their medical safety and efficacy through the FDA. The funny thing is that the research with psychedelics has been allowed to go forward while the research with marijuana has been blocked for political reasons. And that's sort of a hidden story behind medical marijuana that a lot of people aren't aware of, that marijuana is the only drug for which the federal government has a monopoly on the supply of research-grade material. So no one has ever been able to actually, you know, the opponents of marijuana legalization will often say, well, you know, it's not an FDA-approved drug. It's not considered a medicine unless the FDA has approved it. But that's completely disingenuous because of the monopoly that the National Institute on Drug Abuse has, and because of the Drug Enforcement Administration's protection of that monopoly by refusing to license alternate suppliers who could produce marijuana for FDA research. It sort of forced medical marijuana advocates in a lot of ways to jump ahead of the medical process and say, well, let's just make it accessible. Where with psychedelics, because the research is allowed to go forward, you know, it's been able to happen in a more gradual and scientific manner in some ways than what's happened in medical marijuana. I mean, people always, there's still something that's incongruous to people about the idea of states regulating a drug. You know, we've had the FDA since what, like 1906 or something. There's a reason we have federal standards for what's considered a medicine. And so I think it'll be interesting to see how that process plays out as, you know, when psychedelics get further down the road and actually, if they are actually made available as a medicine, you know, if that triggers a broader shift in public opinion, or if it sort of stays within the medical model at that point.
Right.